Okay, so this is where we were. And again, I think the best thing for me would be as you start to have questions, put them in the chat so that I can see them and kind of deal with them at the right time, whether that's the right time or we'll get to it at another point. So if you can. So this is about me. So a couple things we want to talk about today. We kind of understand that with real estate, especially, there's a lot of influence that's paid by the federal tax code. And we're using the tax code in the way of the code itself, as well as tax credits created to support real estate development. And for the most part, this presentation is focused on the federal tax credits. We'll mention every now and then where the state of Washington overlays. The state does not have an income tax. So generally, we don't have as robust of support mechanisms within Washington state, but there are some areas, in terms of Washington's taxes that help us. And there's also some uniqueness of trying to do real estate within Washington state that we also want to highlight. And the first one is, at least as you're doing real estate in Washington, where you're working with public sponsors, public agencies. The one thing they have to understand is that there is a lending of credit prohibition within our Washington state constitution that's fairly conservative. Now, I work around the Western United States, and frankly, every state that came into the Union after the Civil War has similar language in their respective constitutions limiting credit, meaning that the government can't lend its credit for private gain. And really, that was a protection against, the railroads and timber industries that, really took advantage of a lot of federal largesse in terms of how they were able to establish their businesses. So states have these prohibitions. It makes it difficult to use public funds. So the dollars generated by local government, the sales tax, B&O tax, that we collect locally, to use those dollars for private projects, private development entities. For the most part, Washington state has not had tax increment financing, which is a technique of using future property taxes as a way of investing in real estate projects today. We have a modified version. It was just passed in the legislature last year, where there's limited amounts of financing available for the public infrastructure around properties. But for the most part, in a lot of states in the country, TIF, or tax increment financing, is a big source of financing for real estate investments. And then the real impact of this is that, again, we can spend billions of dollars on rail investments, which we are, but virtually impossible to use those legal resources to fund small businesses. The Rainier Valley Development Fund, a CDFI established in the Rainier Valley as part of mitigation for sound transit, the dollars that they use to capitalize their investments in businesses, those were actually federal dollars, not local dollars. So what this prohibition has done is it's kind of limited some of the creativity of local governments, just because there's legal issues, and it places great importance on federal resources. So we've always been attentive to what the federal government has available to support the various real estate activities we've done in low-income communities. And then this is my planner world coming out. A finance person would have a much more complicated slide. But in real estate, there's only two sources of funds that are used in real estate. And if you think around, simplifying, what can be some complex subjects. So all money in a real estate project is either debt, meaning that it can come from a private lender, a bank, or a public lender. But it's debt, so it's expected to get repaid from cash flow. Whatever your project is that generates cash flow, there would be an expectation of some of that cash flow paying off that debt. So it's a liability to the project. And then if something's not debt, it's equity. Again, either public or private equity. And if they have equity in a project, then generally it's paid back if there are profits. So equity investors will do lots of ways of trying to, get as close to a guarantee return as possible, but generally it's at risk. So debt lenders are paid first, and then equity is paid. And you may have public funds that will kind of postpone payment or be flexible in payment for a long time. But really everything comes down to one of those two sources of funding for a project. And in the community development world, and again, the economic development world, there's not a lot of free money in community development. There does seem to be an approach that for a lot of these projects, somehow the dollars should revolve. We want to create these perpetual funds. So there's generally an assessment of trying to figure out, can we provide funds to have them repaid, which just makes it more challenging in projects that don't have strong economics to begin with. Then the other rule that we have to work with a lot within, sorry, this has gone backwards, is again, just this notion, and just kind of let your mind think about this. Development costs generally are greater than fair market value. That the real estate you're involved with, there's the cost of developing that real estate. But that's not the value of the real estate. The value of the real estate is based on what the income generated from the project or what someone's prepared to pay. And it's absolutely common that our development costs are greater than that fair market value. You know, and the common analogy would be if you do look at buying a house or if you have bought a house, we never think when we buy that house, what did it cost to build that house? We always think about what's its value in the marketplace, what are these other 10 people looking to bid on this house? You know, so the value is what someone will pay for it. Debt and equity, those sources of funds that come into a real estate project, really they're focused on the fair market value of the project. What's the cash that's being provided? Because that's how they're going to get paid back. And if development costs exceed fair market value, which is absolutely common, that does not mean that the project is not a good project. Then it means that conventional debt and equity will not be sufficient to cover development costs. So you're going to have debt and equity related to fair market value. You're going to have a cost that's higher than that. And we'll go through some examples where you'll see that differential pretty significantly how we filled it. But you're going to have a funding gap. There's absolutely common in the community development world. Lots of techniques and things being used to try and fill that funding gap, you know, tax benefits and tax credits being one of them. So filling the gap, again, there's only two ways of doing to fill gaps. Again, real estate trying to be simple, and that's either decreasing the use of funds. You know, what are your project costs, and are there ways that we can reduce those costs? I mean, we have, you know, things like a bargain sale. Maybe you can buy the property at a lower price and provide a tax donation to the owner. So the owner gets the same benefits of that value, but you actually only have to pay less. We've talked a lot about an EDI. The EDI initiative has tried to provide a lot of resources for the purchase of land, again, to reduce or eliminate that cost of land. You can look at changing your development program, what's built on the property, as a way of trying to decrease the project costs, you know, value engineering, and again, as a way of evaluating a real estate project. Are there ways that we can, you know, build it cheaper, more or less expensively? Again, recognizing that debt and equity are functions of fair market value. So you really don't have the ability to affect those in any material way. And then the other way is increasing our sources of funds. So there's the use of funds or there's the source of funds. So we can look for other kinds of debt. And these are debt products that, again, generally can be subordinated, take on more risks. This is where we see public funds involved in these projects and intermediary lenders where, again, they may be prepared to lend behind other lenders, bear more risk in the project. There are tax abatements. This is where in Washington state, we can't collect taxes and necessarily provide those funds to certain projects, but we can choose to not collect taxes. So we have a multifamily housing abatement program. If you agree to limit the affordability of your units, then we'll choose to abate the taxes that come from that property. And same thing with historic projects where, again, because of the cost of renovating, then we'll choose to abate taxes so we don't collect them. If you reduce the taxes owed on a project, then that increases its cash flow. And then lastly, maybe you can provide some grants. Again, we don't see a lot of that. And then again, the last thing is what we're really kind of getting to is how can we bring additional equity not debt, but additional equity to the project through either the use of taxes or the use of federal tax credits. So the federal tax code, the taxes have been in the press a lot, especially under the last administration, as we look to adjust the tax code and how it treated certain kinds of things and tax rates. But there's two ways in which the tax code influences real estate. There are lots of ways in which the tax code can reduce our income, and so it reduces the taxes we owe. And then there are tax credits, which actually reduce the taxes paid. So if we think about our individual circumstances when we go to fill out our taxes every year, there is our gross income, and then there are adjustments that we can make, interest expenses, other kinds of expenses that we're allowed to deduct from our income. Those deductions reduce our income for tax purposes, so it reduces the taxes owed. And then once we know the taxes that we owe, the federal government has a number of ways in which we can use credits to offset those taxes dollar for dollar. So we might have, an energy, we might have gotten an alternative energy car. So we have a tax credit for the child care credit that a lot of people are getting now under the new federal dollars. Those tax credits, again, are provided to allow us to reduce our taxes. And if our taxes are zero, then the federal government actually owes us money because of those taxes. So two ways in which, so we reduce our income for tax purposes, and then we can reduce our taxes owed. If we have tax credits, and again, this if you've used the electrical credit for certain investments or other things where that credit offsets your taxes dollar for dollar. So if I owe the government $100 and I have $100 of tax credits, then I can use those and I owe the government zero. Or if I have tax credits of $200, then the government owes me $100. So those credits are really cash. And so investors and organizations can use those credits just like cash, and they'll value them accordingly. So many of our projects that you're involved with that we're working on in community development areas are owned by public or nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits don't pay federal tax generally, and so they can't use tax credits because they're tax exempt. If you don't owe taxes, then a credit has no value to you. So in this world, we end up creating a lot of financing structures and partnerships between private entities and public entities, so that private entities can access those benefits that are not useful to a public entity, but the public entity can still control and own the real estate. We do this in low-income housing all the time. We're creating partnerships around this. So the key is creating mechanisms where the community benefit entity, the nonprofit, that community organization controls the asset, but a private entity is involved so they can benefit from those financial benefits that the nonprofit does not benefit from. So we're creating partnerships. And in a simple way, in Washington state, the states in the country have different ways in which they favor one type of partnership or another. In Washington state, our law generally favors limited liability corporations, or LLCs. And in LLCs, you can have a member manager or non-member manager, and then you have the other members. The member manager can be the nonprofit. So they would be an owner of the partnership. We'd create a partnership around that real estate project. They would be the member manager. They would, in a sense, control or own 0.01% of the assets of the partnership. But as the member manager, they have control of the partnership. They make all the decisions of the partnership. The other members, that even though they own 99.99% of the partnership, they don't have decision-making control over the partnership. So the key thing to understand, at least under the law, is I can own as little as 0.01, but I control the partnership. The investors invest money, they invest their expertise, they get that share of economic benefits from the project, but they don't have a say in the project. So that structure sets up well for where we have nonprofit community organizations that really want to control the asset. And we have investors that really don't want to control the real estate. They really don't want to manage the real estate because that's not what they do. They just want to invest and get the economic benefits that flow from that real estate. And then I don't know, Alicia, can you keep track of the chat room? I don't have it up on my screen, but just let me know if questions are popping in there that you think we should be getting to sooner rather than later.
I will. There's nothing yet, but
okay,
this is
thanks.
going well. Thanks.
Should we pause and kind of see if there are any questions up till now on
Sure.
anything that we've covered so far?
I know I'm kind of going through things pretty quickly. Okay, thumbs up from Pearl.
Cool.
Okay, you're speaking for everybody, Pearl.
You know, I'm getting it so far, so
okay.
I don't want to speak for everybody.
I appreciate that. So now kind of going into our journey specifically around the different tools that are out there for us. There are project-based credits. So there are credits where you can qualify for them because of the project you're doing. So there's the low-income housing tax credit program. You know, as was mentioned before, there's a 9% and a 4% credit on eligible capital costs. So the cost to develop the project. You get that credit for 10 years. You have a 15-year compliance period. There's lots of rules and complexity to it. But you're eligible for that credit because you've applied for it and you're developing low-income housing. The other project-based credit we have is the rehab tax credit, or RTC. A lot of people think of this as just the historic tax credit. And in that credit, if the project's a federal landmark, not a local landmark, but a federal landmark, then you can get a 20% one-time credit on eligible capital costs on that project. So it's available because it's a historic project, it's a landmark. The place-based credits are things like new markets tax credits. We'll get into a little bit of that. Where again, the new markets credit is a 39% credit on investment capital. The structure of the credit is a little bit different, and we'll get into some of that, but it's a 7-year credit period administered by the US Treasury. Again, it's location-based, so the capital must be invested in projects that are located in or provide benefits to low-income communities, whereas the others, it's just the real estate project itself. And if we were going to put opportunity zones on this list, opportunity zones are place-based tax credits. It's still, and I still have my own opinions about, is it really helping low-income projects and community projects? But it is also a place-based tax benefit. And to maximize the equity that we can get from tax credits, it's possible you can use multiple ones. So if you qualify for them, then you're eligible for them. So we can combine low-income credits with historic tax credits. We can combine low-income credits with new markets if we have legally distinct projects, and I'll show an example of that. And again, historic credits with new markets credits. In all of these, there's ways in which you can invest opportunity zones as an additional way of being able to benefit a project. So we'll talk about a little bit of that, as we go through these things. But you can combine them. It's not unfair to say, well, if I qualify for historics and historics, can I use both of them? Absolutely. And you'd have to go through all of the procedures for each one. So it complicates the project because you have to make sure you're meeting the requirements for each credit, but you definitely can use them and then in that way bring more capital to the project. And then the first one that we hear about a lot, it's probably the largest credit program that's out there, is the low-income housing tax credit. You'll often hear this just called the LIHTC program. To be honest with you, it wasn't until recent that I realized that LIHTC was LIHTC. It's just one of those weird kinds of things, but it's low-income housing, and these are federal criteria. So to be eligible for the federal tax credit, at least 20% of your units, so you're building apartments, so at least 20% of those apartments have to rent to households at or below 50% area median income, or 40% at 60%. So there's a threshold that the federal code requires your project to meet to be eligible. Now, in the city of Seattle in 2021, that 50% AMI is a one-person household of $40,000. That's $19.50 an hour. A family of four, it's $57,000. So the federal government is going to provide that credit because you're agreeing to limit the rent. And the rent is based on the income of the people in the unit. The rent has nothing to do with the costs of the unit. So again, it's a key thing to recognize in a lot of these things that we're in the low-income housing program, we're dictating what the revenue is that you can get. And you just have to figure out how to absorb that within the development costs. The low-income housing tax credit program that's administered by states, and in the state of Washington, that's the Washington State Finance Commission. This is their website. So they administer that program. So they control the rules. They can amend, they can supplement, they can do literally whatever they want. Every year they release what they call a qualifying application program, a plan which dictates how they're going to allocate their credits. So in Washington state now, while the federal government might let you have 20% of your units at 50%, really to win credits in Washington state, you're going to have to do a lot more than that. Almost 100% of those units are going to have to be at much lower households. And they can do that because they write the rules for how they're going to apply their credits. You can apply for the 4% or the 9% credit, and I'll show you what those mean and how they're computed. Again, eligible capital cost. So what does it cost you to build the project? And then we're going to give you a credit against the cost of that. You get that credit for over a 10-year period. So investors will know what credits they're going to get over that 10-year period. They'll value those benefits and kind of price their equity accordingly. There's a 15-year compliance period. So 5 years you're not getting credits, but you have to apply. You have to comply. There's another 15-year extended compliance period. And again, under the state of Washington, you really have to be, at least 55 years. In terms of, it's really creating permanent affordable housing for the most part.
Call from total free.
Yeah, I know that's this.
Call from
There we go. Sorry, folks. That's so unprofessional. So this gets kind of the question of, well, should you look at the 4% or the 9%? And when we look at those considerations, there's a lot of complexity. So I'm not trying to get into all the detail. If you're curious or interested, going to the finance agency website and running through materials is useful. There's a whole consultant world out there of people that can help you. But in Washington state, so one practical thing is, will you get an award? So a lot of people like the 9% credits. It generates more equity. But will you get an award? And in Washington state, they kind of ration the credits around. So Seattle, King County area get a certain percent of allocation. So you're going to be in a real competitive pool. So you may or may not be able to win an allocation. And the program is at a point now where with the consultants, you can kind of rank your project with the different point systems, and you kind of know based on what you want to do with your project, whether you would be in the ballpark or not. So you would definitely scope that out. Can I get an award? And you might be okay with starting the process and maybe I'll get an award the second year I apply rather than the first year. But you also have to focus on what they want your project to be. So 9% projects in Washington state right now typically target to lower income households. Again, permanent housing to move from homelessness. So you're probably looking at a project that's going to be like 30% area median income. So again, that's a one-person household at like $12 an hour, and or special needs populations, mental health housing, populations with disabilities. So it's going to be a certain kind of project that the state is going to want you to build, and that may or may not be the project that you're thinking about. So there's that practical side. There's the political, will affordable housing be supported locally? I mean, we have had concerns in a lot of neighborhoods in Seattle that have a lot of low-income housing already, where they don't necessarily want more low-income housing. We like the idea of diversification of things. So there could be an issue locally. There's been talk of 100% affordable housing with mixed use, mixed income possibilities, meaning that you mix incomes within the building. Still has been, for the most part, a unicorn in the real estate world, because again, generally the funders want to see a high level of concentration in terms of the affordability of the units. And then again, the state policy can conflict with local economic development goals. So the state of Washington, through the Finance Commission, they're creating the policy about how they're going to allocate tax credits. And their planning horizon doesn't necessarily worry about local community development goals. So oftentimes you can have a mismatch between what their goals are versus what your goals are. So we see in this case, a lot of projects opt to use 4% credits. In the 4% program, you're going to generate less income because it's 4, not 9. But there's less restrictions on that project. And in the 4% world, the 4% credits require bond financing or tax exempt financing from this. That's provided by the state. So what you're really doing, if you're in a 4% project area, you're really applying for bond cap, or what's called private activity bond cap. And most of the time there's more than enough. Lately, it's been a little constrained in terms of bond cap. So sometimes we've had some trouble in terms of how that happens. But the 4% gives you more flexibility. Usually the finance agencies, policies are focused much more on the 9%. So we've seen that in the city of Seattle. A lot of the projects that you hear about are using 4% credits. And really the city's housing levy is really becoming a supplement. It's investing in those projects and really kind of making up for the equity you're not getting from the 9% credits. So we have other sources. And here's some examples. These are all from 12th Avenue Arts, which was a 4% project. And then 2 projects that Seed did in Southeast Seattle. And then the last one is obviously the financial, which is what works for the project. Because sometimes people will get focused on a tool or a financing source. And that may not be the right financing tool. You may not want to have your rents constrained versus what the market would be, or you may not want the requirements to come with it. So you just want to think about that practicality as well. And then what are they worth? What do you get with the low-income credits? So if we have $1 million of eligible development costs, and those are, for the most part, if you think about the cost to develop the real estate project, there are some of those costs that are not eligible, but that gets into a detail that you don't need to worry about. But if it costs us $1 million to develop this project, if we're applying in the 9%, so we get 9% of that $1 million or $90,000 a year in credits, we get those for a 10-year period or $900,000 of credits. Now, investors will know that they're going to get those credits for that 10-year period. So they'll value that, they'll get a return on their investment. So they're going to invest, in this case, $855,000. They're going to get back $900,000 in credits. They're going to get some other tax benefits. So that's how they're going to value their investment in the partnership. So a project that costs us $1 million, now we've got $855,000 coming from our investor. Now we have to go find the other $145,000. So it really helps us in terms of raising funds for our project. And in the 4% program, the math is exactly the same, but it's 4%. So it generates less equity. You can see 380,000 rather than 855. So people are tempted in the 9% world a lot. But again, you may not win an award there, or again, there may be other problems. But it definitely brings equity in that you can use for construction. And I would say the other thing to factor in, I'm just letting you know, there's a lot of detail around the qualifying process for the state finance agency. Lots of ways in which they are trying to maximize the distribution of tax credits around the state of Washington, kind of for obvious reasons. So even though our project may cost $1 million, they may not give us credit against that $1 million. There's a lot of times in which the agency will determine how much of your cost will they allow you to count. So for instance, in Seattle King County, right now, the Finance Commission believes that it costs you $367,000 to build a 1-bedroom unit. Now, I don't know what it costs to build a 1-bedroom unit, but if it costs you more than that, then they're not going to give you credit for that additional expense. They're only going to let you have credits on 367. When I was working in Wyoming, Wyoming would only let you count 50% of your capital costs against the credit. So again, just because the federal law would allow you to be eligible for something does not mean that the state agency allocating the credits will let you have that same benefit. And again, especially in the 9% credit, in the 4% credit, that's where generally you're going to get all of the benefits that your project would be eligible for. And I'll just pause in case anybody has any questions around the low-income housing credit.
Chuck, this is Melissa. Just as a time check, we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm wondering if it makes sense to skip to examples, or if you want to kind of touch on new market tax credits. I'm just wanting to maybe poll the room to see what would be the most interesting to the crew.
Yeah, I'll move. I can move quick. I'll go through these just so you can see them. But I'll move through these quickly, Melissa. Try and get to examples because I want to get to some of the opportunities on questions because I know people asked about that. And
great.
But this was just showing again in that partnership diagram. The member manager and the investor is going to invest $855 into this. For the historic credit, really the math is the same thing. On a national landmarks list, the National Park Service approves your plans. So they make sure that what you're doing doesn't disrupt any of the historic features they want to see protected. So there may be issues with what you want to do in the building and what they want you to do. Again, 20% credit, the math works exactly the same way. Generally, the historic credit has been more valuable. They'll pay it higher, again, because they get it all at one time rather than over 10 years. But the math, the investing process is virtually the same. And then the new markets world, again, place-based. It's a weird credit because it's a credit to investment capital. So the credit doesn't come directly to the project. The project gets the benefit of lower cost financing. So in this is kind of the math of it. If I apply to the federal treasury, I get an award of $10 million of new markets credits. Again, that credit rate is 39% over 7 years. So similar to the same way we work the math for credits in the other one. So I'm going to get credits of 3.9 million. Investors will value that. Now, new markets is over 7 years. It's a different credit, so it's not worth as much. So they'll only pay 86 cents. But I can raise $3.3 million through that credit. So I only need to raise another 6.6 million to do my $10 million project. So if I'm a $10 million project, I'm a health clinic or a community center, I only have to find 6.9 million of funding to make my project work. That's really how new markets works and what's its benefit are to people. There's a lot more complication to this, but fundamentally the project is going to get about 20 to 25% of your capital cost that kind of revolve from the credit itself. It is place-based, so these are the eligible areas in the Seattle area now. These will change next year as soon as the census is fully incorporated. So some of these census tracts will fall out. In this the last census, Capitol Hill dropped out. So a lot of those projects wouldn't be eligible anymore. And then the key for new markets and why it's real, I don't spend a lot of time because it's really hard to get new markets credits, to be candid with you. You have to be in a census tract. You have to be in a more distressed census tract. Do you have a compelling story to a project? Because there's a lot of competition. There's only 40% of the allocation available to urban communities in the United States. We do not have a CDE, the entities that apply for credits. We don't have one that's based in Washington State right now. So we don't have lead folks. So it's a challenge for projects in Washington State. If the project is less than $5 million, it's really hard to get people's attention. If it's more than $20 million, it's hard to get enough people to want to help with the project. So it's just become much more of a challenge now. I actually don't like the program very much because it's just been very difficult for Seattle projects to compete nationally, which is unfortunate. We've had some really good projects there in the past. So examples, this is one of the ones that this is the Bullet Building up on Madison. You know, one of the highest level sustainable buildings in the world. And again, this is exactly that example I explained. It cost $30 million to build the building, but its value was only $15 million, meaning that the rents that are charged in the building only has a value of $15 million. So the Bullet Foundation was prepared to invest in this as a testament to their environmental values, but could we find ways for them to save money? Well, we did bonds and equity that was brought into this. And then we had tax credit. We had solar credits and we had new markets of 6.5. So 26% of their project was able to be done with equity provided by tax credits. So that was $8 million the foundation didn't have to fund. So it saved them that much. This is the old INS building down off of Airport Way. The owners of it bought the building from the federal government. Frankly, they paid too much going right into the recession. So they had to figure out a way of absorbing the building with that high cost. The solution is always artist project. So it became a place for artists. Again, project costs were 8.7 million. The value was only 6.5. And in this one, we had a bank loan of $3 million. The city lent $3 million. The owners put in $1.3 million. And then this was a historic building. And the new markets provided 27% of the building. So they did the twin credits, you know, and again, brought in 27% of their capital sources. This is 12th Avenue Arts up on Capitol Hill on 12th Avenue, a project of Capitol Hill Housing, Community Roots Now. Again, there's two components to it. There's an affordable housing component. Does somebody have a question? So there's an affordable housing project, and then there's kind of a non-housing portion of it. The site was used as the parking lot for the West Precinct, and the deal with the city was that they would transfer the property to Capitol Housing in exchange for parking, to replace parking for the West Precinct there. So they had to kind of, in a sense, subsidize the project that way because the parking facility cost more than the land was worth, but that was the deal. They had to provide the parking. So the affordable housing side of the project, separate partnership, because we can't mix LIHTC costs with, in this case, new markets. $23 million that they paid for with, you know, the bonds, private activity bonds. This was a 4% credit project. Again, state and city grants, and then we can see the LIHTC credit there that was provided about 5.6 million. So 24% of the project came from those low-income housing credits. And on the commercial side, the commercial portion, that front piece on 12th Avenue was $22 million. Again, that was paid for with a bank loan of only 3.8 million. The city put a little bit of money in there, and the rest was their money plus new markets tax credits of 5.1. I mean, this was one of the first capital campaigns for community art space, not one of the major kind of art venues. So again, it worked out pretty well, but the equity coming from new markets was about 23% of the project. And the last one is the biggest one that I've worked on. This is the PacMed Center up on Beacon Hill, large reuse of that building. The state stepped in so it wouldn't be developed for condos. And there's a lot of community tenants in there, Fair Start, Neighbor Care. I forget the community health facility that's in there as well. but 205,000 square feet, state project. The state appropriated 20 million for the project. Final budget was $56 million, so they had a big gap. And so the way we worked it through, again, project was 56, value was 39, absolutely common. We got some money from the State Finance Commission, 2 million. We got equity coming from new markets and historic, so it was eligible for both. And in this case, the historic tax credit was worth more to the project, but 29% came through those tax credits. And then there was fundraising, and then the state had to increase their state appropriation from $20 million. They didn't like doing that, but that was a lot better than them having to come up with $56 million. I mean, this one was complicated because you're doing 2 tax credits, so you have to follow the rules for both. We had 6 state agencies involved. Each of them had their own attorney. We had 1 investor, 3 CDEs, and 7 law firms. It was excruciating, but it got done and kind of showed, again, a public purpose building can still be done with these tax credits. And then that's it. What I wanted to kind of quickly go over for opportunity zones, because we didn't have a slide here for it, is opportunity zones is really a program that in real estate, when you sell real estate, generally when you sell real estate, it has a higher value than it cost you. And we've been having tax benefits where we can reduce our taxes because of owning real estate. Well, when we sell the real estate, now those taxes become due, and that gain in value, we pay a tax, and that's where capital gains comes from. And there's a lot of political discussion around capital gains taxes, and is it good that we tax it at the rate we do? Should we tax it higher? Because it's wealthier people that pay capital gains. In the real estate world, there's what's called 1031 exchanges, where I end up exchanging property, so don't actually realize the capital gain, so I don't have to pay the tax. What opportunity zones allow for is it allows you to pay that to go ahead and cash out your stocks, cash out your real estate. But instead of paying capital gains immediately, you can invest those capital gains into a partnership doing investments in certain low-income census tracts. And you can delay the payment and reduce the payment of capital gains on that amount of money. But the biggest benefit is the money that I invest in a project. If I keep it in the project for 10 years, I don't pay any capital gains on that. So you can imagine, so I cash out my Microsoft stock, and I invested in a project in Seattle. And in 2026, I pay a lower portion of my capital gains, but then my investment in that project in Seattle after 10 years, I pay no capital gains regardless of what that upside is. So it's been attracting a lot of investment capital. We haven't seen investor yields change though. So we're not seeing projects that wouldn't be done otherwise until we kind of see investor requirements kind of soften a bit to be able to invest in low-income communities. We don't know yet how it will work for different kinds of projects than kind of projects that generate market returns in the first place. And then I'm happy to, I know we rushed through that a bit, so I'm happy to kind of now, any questions people have, just have at it.
Chuck, I'm going to put one out there. Where do you find tax credit investors?
Generally, to find the investors, it depends on the credit. So if I'm doing with a low-income housing credit, there's a bunch of funds, all of the banks that do low-income credit. So you can throw a stick out your door and you can find an investor for low-income housing credits. That's not a hard one. I mean, they'll want to make sure that you can pull this off, but it's generally going to be big banks and funds. For the historic credit, I usually start with the bank that I'm working with, because most of the banks can take tax credits. There are some syndicators out there, and actually the McMinimans in Tacoma, their tax credit investor was their paint company. The Sherwin-Williams does tax credits for projects that use Sherwin-Williams paint. So I usually start with the bank I'm working with, and then some of the vendors, like Sherwin-Williams for historics, because it's unique that way. But that's where I start with. Or if you have At some point, you're going to have a real estate attorney generally involved in a real estate project. And usually the real estate attorneys, their network will kind of identify some people you can talk to as well.
Yeah, Chair, I had a question regarding some of the examples you mentioned. You mentioned the equities coming from LIHTC and from historic. I mean, those equities, are, throughout the 10-year period or whatever. So upfront costs, they're still the bank or whatever the finance, they're going to pay the upfront costs, right?
Yeah, generally the equity investors, so that credit person, the law requires them to have most of their investment in the project before construction ends. They have to be at risk. So you'll see the investors will they'll give you 25% up front, then another 50% at a certain time. So they'll phase their money in, but they have to be all in before the project is open and ready. And a bank construction lender will usually bridge against that equity investment. It's a pretty safe in terms of a bank loan against that.
Thank you.
But you're right. At the end of the day, you need the money to build the project. So you're bridging against it, or the investor is paying it on a schedule.
Yeah, I had another question. In terms of getting the numbers, in terms of the project cost and all the pre-development work, even before design, while you're trying to get all of the numbers, who's paying for that activity?
Well, that's the hard part, because there's not a really good source of capital for that pre-development work. Generally that's, the expertise of the development team, architect, working on it, they'll get paid when the project gets construction. There are some public pre-development loan funds run by like Impact Capital, that if it's a housing project, if you're doing a LIHTC, a low-income housing tax credit project, oftentimes some of the investors have separate pre-development loan programs that they provide to help you get through that. But there's not a really good source for it. It's pretty uneven right now in the marketplace.
Okay, so a majority of the time people either volunteer in advance and just to get that package together to start presenting it to potential investors.
Yeah. Or the team you put together, the architect, contractor, they're all kind of in a sense working for free for a while until the project can secure. Usually it's then securing the construction loan to help, to now pay for those costs. I mean, we do see a lot of projects that kind of force themselves to be low-income housing projects because there are resources for pre-development for low-income housing tax credit projects. There aren't for the other ones. A couple of people are trying to, a lot of us in the intermediate, we're trying to find ways of providing that capital. It's just really hard. It's a very risky period in the project. Not a lot. It's just not a very good system right now, unfortunately.
I guess just thinking about more, is there more organizations working on that particular portion where you're trying to get like there's no money out there, but you're trying to get people together? You said you guys are trying to work on some program, or is there other parts of other governmental organizations that are helping on that?
Well, I haven't seen anything that's at scale. I mean, generally the folks that are involved in potential pre-development money, again, Impact Capital has that product already available. Again, I think for the most part, they provide those funds for housing projects that they think, are going to be successful. Both LISC and Enterprise, two national intermediaries, kind of like NDC. I know they have some programs to provide pre-development lending. We're starting to look at how to create one. But I would say the Impact Capital is probably the best starting point. But if you're not really doing an affordable housing project, it's really hard, in the if it's a nonprofit facility, then I think you're looking at, you might be able to talk to some foundations. The state of Washington through Washington Commerce has a capital program where sometimes you can get some pre-development money through Commerce. If you have support from a local legislator, there may be a way to get some money out that way. But there's nothing really organized if it's a non-housing project.
Thank you. And are the slides going to be available?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are the slides you presented, are they going to be sent out as well?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Melissa put her email address in. We weren't going to automatically send them to everyone, but it's in the chat. And if you email her, she'll send a copy. It's M Lafayette at NDC Online. Do you see it?
Yes.
Oh, great.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
And Melissa, we might want to attach one of our previous kind of opportunity zone presentations. I mean, the mechanics of it haven't changed even with some of the timing. So maybe at least that will help folks to kind of better understand OZs.
Sure, I can definitely include that.
Chuck, do you have time for one more question if there is one?
Oh, sure.
Does anyone else have one?
I'll ask a quick question if I may. Hi, Chuck. I had trouble with the audio earlier.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask a question.
Well, I can't pass up a chance to ask you something. Awakening that's going on, folks understanding, and maybe the traditional investment market changing how they view the projects, community-led projects. What excites you about the next couple of years, 2 to 5 years? What do you see coming? What changes can we hope to see?
Well, I like to think of myself as a skeptical optimist. Because I actually think what I think we're going to see is we're going to see a lot more money available. I mean, with COVID, with the times, the interest, and I think it's sincere interest from the financial community. I think we are going to see more resources for community-led, BIPOC-led organizations. Where I become skeptical is I still haven't seen where people are easing the burdens of accessing that capital. So we may have a big fund set up to do something, but if we're not being more flexible on the terms for using that fund, then we're not helping anyone. So the same problem we're trying to respond to, we're using that as an impediment to getting money out the door. Now, I think most of the people I work with in that world, similar organizations, they all understand that. So I think we're all trying to figure out, any of us that are in the capital world, there's very little risk we're able to take with those dollars. And so I think we're working with investors to ease on some of those so we can really be intentional with investments in communities. So I think over the next few years, you're going to see much better access to resources than there have been in the past. I'm just convinced of that because everybody sees it. Everybody wants to do it. We just have to get out of our way.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. And Alicia, I would think kind of going forward, if, obviously this is a lot of information to throw at people. So if there are questions or you want to revisit something, they can always, they can send an email or question, then we can kind of get information out or be responsive after today if there's questions.
Absolutely. We can get an answer and you can, if you've been, I think, getting these emails through COO, you can email Melissa, whose address is in the chat, and we're in close contact with the organizations that you got sent the invite. So you can always reach out to someone, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year. We wish everyone good luck and safe safe holidays and transition to all of your new projects in your next budget season. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you so much, Chuck. It was great to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Guys.
Thank you. Thank you all.
You're welcome.